Hello, gunfighters, and welcome to Gunfighter Life, the podcast where we talk about gunfighting and gun-related stuff the right way with God at the center. First and foremost, I am a Christian. That is number one in my life, serving God, following Jesus. Combat veteran, served in the United States Marine Corps and the Army. Also law enforcement veteran, private contractor, state rifle and pistol champion. Professional big game hunter and guide. If you feel called to support, check out Patreon. There should be a link in the show notes. With that, and I am blessed to serve you today. Well, gunfighters, let's wax philosophical. I'm on a road trip, which means I got time. Nobody, I don't think, has ever claimed that a gunfighter cannot be philosophical. So let us gather together, be circumspect, and consider the philosophy of the 5.7. Now, I've done a whole cartridge talk on the 5.7. I may integrate it or not into this episode. Haven't decided yet. But let us gather together. Let's talk about some philosophy of the 5.7. Is it a super fast novelty, barely more than a gimmick, a answer in search of a question? Or is it perhaps the way of the future in handguns and a highly underrated cartridge that is just now starting to pick up steam? You see, the 5.7 is not new. It's been around since 1990 at least, I believe. And I'm doing this from memory. Go back and double check that. So it's been around a few decades. But for a long time, you basically, this isn't exactly true because you had some experimental and some uppers and stuff like that. But for main buy-it-off-the-shelf guns, you only had really the FN PS90 and the FN 5.7. Again, there may have been some experimental AR type stuff, but really that was it. So it kind of stayed in this very niche market. And like a lot of very niche things, you got your diehard FN guys, just like you have your diehard Glock people or your diehard H&K people, where like anything that they do, it's got to be the best or the best company. Well, let's take a step back. This was originally designed, I believe, for a personal defense weapon. So that was its whole reason for coming into existence. A government request for a personal defense weapon, longer range, high velocity, for personal defense, which seems like on the surface it might have some pretty good crossover application for civilians. Like, we're all about personal defense. So first let's talk about it in its PDW guise, and I would consider a PDW something larger than your average handgun, something a bigger platform. We may call them AR pistols or whatever, but in reality they're their own mutant kind of quasi in between a long gun and a handgun world. They're this independent thing, I think, this PDW world. You know, you could anywhere from basically a full-size fighting handgun with a fold-out stock, which is nothing new, they've been around a long time, to a very compact kind of submachine gun, as in the PS90, CZ Scorpion, something that gives you more firepower and or more shootability than an average full-size fighting handgun, but is much more compact than your standard rifle or even carbine like an M4. Those options discussed are quite a bit smaller and handier and concealable, packable, maybe a better word, than like even a lightweight carbine in M4. So with all that in mind, you could do that with a 9mm. You could do it with a 40 Smith & Wesson, a 45 ACP, even a 32, as in the Scorpion. Why the 5.7? Well, the 5.7 gives a much smaller projectile at a much higher velocity. I don't think that's news to anybody out there. You're talking very light projectiles, 20-something, 30-something, 40 grain. That's light even for projectiles for the 5.56, which is known for being a lightweight, high-velocity projectile. Now, you're not getting quite the power of that, but you're in that world of a bottlenecked, high-velocity, light-for-caliber weapon. Kind of that same velocity, high-velocity, small projectile kind of philosophy that you get with the 223 5.56, but it's scaled down even further. And I think it's no surprise that in its original guise for military, law enforcement, and we have a much more clear distinction here in America because of posse comitatus and things like that versus some other countries. You know, European countries, South American countries, they run a far different, let's say, grayer line between military and law enforcement roles, I think, than we do. We have a pretty clear distinction where, except for National Guard, you know, American military does stuff on foreign soil and law enforcement polices stuff here at home. But other countries and stuff have kind of crossover roles, anti-terrorism, stuff like that. But in a military police guise, they don't have to abide by American NFA rules and restrictions. The 5.7 in a full auto, there's no question of its effectiveness as in PDW in a full auto, I don't think. 9mm doesn't have a lot of recoil, but if you've ever, fired a HK MP5, it does have some recoil. If you ever fired an Uzi, it has recoil. If you can reduce that recoil and keep those rounds on target instead of 3 or 4 on target before that gun, that platform walks off the target, if you can keep that gun on target with controlled bursts and get all those hit center mass. What was that quote? I think one of the Soviet leaders, it's attributed to him, maybe Stalin, I don't know. I'm not hip on all the Soviet sayings, but quantity has a quality all its own. And when you go dumping, let's just say a dozen ice pick style projectiles into somebody's torso, even if they're ever so small, that's going to be traumatic, to put it mildly. So there's that. So you kind of get rid of that for the American civilian, right? Because we don't have access to full auto P90s. Law enforcement, I'm not aware of any law enforcement agencies that use the P90. There may be some special units somewhere, CIA, somebody might use them, but I'm not aware of any like departments or anything that use them. They may. But for most American civilians, you're dealing with a semi-automatic version, and because of the, let's just say the NFA, you can't have the small compact package. You kind of have to have a 16-inch barrel, or you have to go the tax stamp route, which is its own kind of restriction. So you kind of get rid of a lot of that. So I'm going to say for the American civilian semi-auto 16-inch barrel P90 or something like it, it's of limited, I think, usefulness with all those restrictions and all those limitations placed on this platform and a rifle. You really are probably better served with something else unless you just want a super unique, low recoiling, high velocity round. And you may. But I think for practicality's sake, for a home defense gun, for a truck gun, there's probably a lot more practical, sensible options than a P90. If you want one, go for it. But I think that if you're not dealing with keeping that gun on target during bursts and you're talking to semi-auto, you ought to be able to recover in the time of a little, even a 9mm recoil in a semi-auto. So you might negate a lot of that. Now let's talk about the philosophy of the 5.7 in a handgun. We've kind of settled as a culture here in America, and I guess around the world, maybe we were slow to the party because a lot of other countries went to 9mm long before we kind of made it to standard. We were still chasing 45 and 40 Smith & Wesson and 357 SIG. A lot of other people had already settled on 9mm. And we've kind of come to the conclusion that 9mm, you may disagree with this, I'm talking colloquially as a gun culture, if I can speak for the gun culture of America, that colloquially the 9mm is the best balance and broad spectrum self-defense handgun round. End of sentence. I think we have come to that conclusion, and I think rightfully so. I think for the vast majority of situations, circumstances, environments, platforms, 9mm is the way to go. If somebody says, I'm looking to get into handgun shooting competition, concealed carry, what do you recommend? I'm almost certainly, if there's no other caveats, arthritis, some other extenuating circumstance, I'm going to say 9mm. It's a good, proven defensive round. It is affordable. The ammunition is readily available. As far as centerfire handgun ammunition goes, it's not as cheap as it used to be, but it's not prohibitively expensive to train with. One of the guys in the Patreon chat, which I'd be a bad capitalist if I did not mention, talked a lot about guns and gun stuff, and hopefully more important stuff in the Patreon chat. So if you want to be a part of that, and mostly to support the show, consider becoming a patron. But in the Patreon chat, one of the guys asked about 357 SIG. I think it's a fantastic caliber. This is a little aside, but it'll tie back in. I think it's a fantastic caliber. I have one of my go-to carry guns. It came as a 357 SIG because I got a really good deal on it. Part of that, I think, was the caliber. I could buy that gun and a 9mm conversion barrel and still come out on top, I think. So I bought that gun. It has a 357 SIG. I carried it for a while in 357 SIG. I went hunting with it successfully in 357 SIG. It's a good cartridge. But I carry it in 9mm, and I don't have any plans to switch back to 357 SIG. You gain a little bit in 357 SIG, but I think you give up more. I don't care how good you can control recoil. If you reduce it, you can control it better. That's the initial reason when I was a cop, and everybody was saying 40, 40, 40, and I started competition shooting. You couldn't convince me, no matter how many people told me, that 40 was better, because I knew how fast I could shoot it in a given, let's say, designated circle, chest area, in a given amount of time versus 9mm. And I could get many more hits in a certain amount of time with 9mm. And even at the time when everybody said it had to be 40 or 45, and I went through that whole spectrum, I decided 9mm was the way to go. And I think that you give up more in the 40, in the 357 SIG, in recoil. You get more power, but you get more recoil, and it greatly increases your shot recovery time. Again, you could be the biggest dude with, you could crush walnuts between your fingers and have super strong grip and just be built like a Hulk of a man. I don't care how much you lean towards that side of the spectrum. If you reduce recoil, you'll be able to control it better, and you get less recoil with a 9mm. Again, it's kind of that good balance. And if you get good, solid, technologically advanced projectiles, it's a fine defensive round. With that being said, why? Why would anybody even consider the 5.7? Why is 5.7 picking up speed? Let me be honest with you here. A lot of people, I think, that buy a 5.7, I'm just going to be honest. We are a culture here of, I would say, more Amazonians sometimes than Americans. We want to just buy and click our way into happiness. We want to buy the next shiny thing. We want to just purchase something to fix a problem instead of actually improving ourselves to fix a problem. And that goes deeper than the discussion of this. But I think a lot of the reason 5.7 is picking up steam is boredom. 9mm is great, it's awesome, it works, it's affordable, it's reliable. I think a lot of people are just bored with it. I think the vast majority of people that are buying 5.7s are doing it strictly out of novelty and boredom. You get mad at me if you want, maybe that's not you. But I got to imagine a lot of people that are buying the 5.7s in the last 5 years or so are buying it out of novelty, and I don't begrudge them that. If you have expendable income, you're not taking food out of your kid's mouth, and you want to go buy a 5.7 just to have fun with it, have fun with that, right? It's a fun round to shoot. It, going back to that less recoil, that's a real thing. So, fun to shoot. There you go. I would say if you want that, go with 22 long rifle, but hey, I'm not going to begrudge you if you want a cool whiz-bang thing. And I think, honestly, a lot of it is that. And you might get mad at me for that. I know I'm the host of Gunfighter Life, and I like guns too. But I think a lot of people just buy stuff because they want something different. Again, we don't have to overanalyze that and say whether that, it just is what it is. And I think if we're being honest, a lot of people buy it for that reason. But let us consider some more practical aspects of 5.7. What might be some actual advantages of this cartridge in a handgun? And I talked about one in an episode that may air before this, may air after it, I'm not really sure. And that kind of spawned, I guess they lead into each other. So I talked about this. The American Southwest. I have spent quite a chunk of my time in the American Southwest. When I was not fighting in Iraq, I was stationed in 29 Palms. If you've ever been there, my condolences. I was there for quite a while. I spent a big chunk of my life in the desert, and I was an urban warfare instructor for the Marine Corps. I am well acquainted with the Mojave. I was the commander of a tactical team to stop active shooters in a large metropolitan area. That large metropolitan area was in the American Desert Southwest. That's all I'm going to say about that. I have spent many a day in the desert, the Mojave, the Sonoran. I'm familiar with that ecology, I'm familiar with that climate, and the, let's say, unique threats that are posed by that environment. One of the things I think this handgun combination will be good for is long hikes in the American Southwest, where you're only going to carry a handgun. You're not out there to gunfight. You're out there to cover ground. You're hiking the Arizona Trail. You're cross-country mountain biking. If you are from the East Coast and you've never been to the American West, like the American Southwest, where, like, if I'm low on gas right now, I'm east of the Mississippi, yearning to get back out west. But if I run low on gas, I can probably find a gas station in 10, 20 miles. Some places in the American Southwest, you might not see a human for 100 and something miles. It's a vast, stark difference between there and here. Somewhere like that, where you're covering, or may want to cover, vast distances on foot, I think that is a place where this 5.7 might really shine. It's lightweight, and if you have to carry all your ammo, and you're not going to get a resupply, there's no Walmarts to go to, nothing like that. There's a real advantage. You could carry a 5.7 handgun, which is not heavy, and the loaded magazines are not heavy. You got 20 rounds, 21 rounds on tap, right? And I know some have different capacities, but for argument's sake, let's say 21 rounds. A good number on tap, on your person. I don't think I have to remind anybody the dangers that are afoot on the American-Mexican border, right? You might find your way in a gunfight out there, and if all you have is a handgun and that wide-open country, you could do a lot worse than an FN 5.7. Especially if you're a good marksman, you can gain a little bit more distance, and distance equals time, and time equals opportunity to maybe extricate yourself from that situation. And I think there's a lot of advantage there in the 5.7. So lightweight, you can carry the gun, you can carry 20 rounds on tap, maybe a spare mag, and then 2 boxes of ammo. You're 140 rounds, and it doesn't weigh that much. Whereas if you try to carry a Glock 17 with 140 rounds, you get what I'm saying. That's a lot more weight. And even if you say that's too much ammo, I don't want that much. Even just a spare box. Let's say you had the gun and, 3 mags. That's 60-something rounds in a 5.7. That's a good amount of ammo. It's going to weigh less than a comparable thing in 9mm. Just the projectiles alone of a 9mm weigh quite a bit more. So there's a real advantage there if you're hiking long distances on foot. And the Southwest, if you're talking about critters that you might encounter. Yeah, I know there are jaguars in the American Southwest and in Arizona, but they're really, really rare. There are mountain lions, there are javelina, there are, in certain places, wild hogs. There are a lot of coyotes, rattlesnakes, things like that. 5.7, fine. You might argue there's better options, but it's not a horrible option. And again, people behaving badly in almost any environment. I don't care if it's Alaska or the American-Mexican border or suburbia in I don't know, I'm just going to pick a random place. Cleveland, Ohio. Almost always your biggest threat is people doing what they ought not be doing and having to deal with that and change people's behavior. Again, I could think of better options than the 5.7, but I could think of a lot worse. And if weight is a primary concern and distance might be a thing, there's a lot of merit there for the 5.7. And I mostly thought about the Southwest because I think that's where it would do best. But if you're a through hiker, on the Appalachian Trail, you might argue 22 Magnum or 22 long rifle even might suffice. But 5.7 again would not be a bad choice if you wanted a fighting handgun, because there's a lot of other platforms, and I'm not going to get into that in this discussion, which one is better, which one is not. But let's just, for argument's sake, they say the OG, the FN 5.7. It's a military-grade handgun. It's a proven platform. It's rugged, it's reliable, it's a full-size fighting handgun. And the entire platform gives you a lot of firepower without a lot of weight. If you were, let's say, mountain biking the Appalachian Trail or something like that, I would say hike the Pacific Crest, but most of these guns are going to be illegal there, sadly. So a long through hike, the Continental Divide Trail, something like that, where you're going mass distances on foot. Also, let's just throw on the peanut butter and chocolate hitting the fan scenario. Let's say that you've decided that you're going to have to bug out on foot, or you've decided that it's very likely that in a really bad scenario, your entire system is going to become man-portable at some point. Gas runs out, electronics go out. Whatever the case is, you got to carry stuff on foot. There's a big power-to-weight ratio advantage in the 5.7. It's a lot of power with a little bit of weight. It's not better than the 9mm, I don't think. But I do think that it's a better power-to-weight ratio. So if you look at what 2 boxes of your most common 9mm ammo weighs, both in expense in weight and expense in size, 2 boxes of 9mm is not small or trivial amount of weight, let alone 4 or 5 boxes if you're hiking food and a canteen cup and water and medical supplies. A gun and ammo is just part of that. Ask the average grunt, as I was one, all the stuff they carry. The guns and ammo doesn't take up the majority of that. You have a lot of other stuff you have to carry and survive. So if you're talking about, after all the other stuff you have, I don't know, let's just pick a number, 15 pounds allotted to ammunition. You can carry a lot more 5.7 in that 15 pounds than you can 9mm or even 223. I'm not telling you it's a better choice. I'm saying it's a viable, real, philosophical, and maybe one day practical application for the 5.7. If you said, I am ready for the big bug out, and I've decided that packing an FN 5.7 full-size fighting handgun on my side, concealable, so that I am more discreet, and having one of those really small AR type platforms, CMMG Banshee or something in 5.7 in my pack or in a scabbard on my back with, let's say, 400 rounds, 500 rounds of 5.7 ammo, which I think would totally be a reasonable loadout. I'd say that's a well thought out and informed decision. I'm glad that you thought about it beforehand and didn't just grab whatever you had because you had a bunch of stuff that looked cool and had cool Cerakote jobs. I'd say good job planning that out. I would say that is a fine, practical, and pragmatic use for the FN 5.7. And that's what I'm talking about. I think there are some niche applications where the 5.7 makes a lot of sense. Let's talk about a much more common day-to-day one. Hunting. I love handgun hunting. I don't think that 5.7 is a good deer round. I just don't. I think if I made a list of top 100 deer rounds, I could think of 100 better ones than the FN 5.7. But there's a lot of other cool things to hunt. I often tell people, if you want to get into hunting, please don't start with deer hunting. There's so many other things you can hunt and learn so much more and get a lot less discouraged. Even a good hunter can hunt a lot. Even a good hunter can go out in a day and day after day and not get a deer or an elk or something like that. There's a lot of other ways and things you can get started hunting. And if you want to get started handgun hunting, I just, tonight for the fun of it, stalked up on a possum. Just for fun, didn't kill it. If I wanted to, I probably could have killed it with my bare hands. I got so close to this possum in the mangrove swamps. It is what it is. And for hunting smaller or medium small game, you want the challenge of hunting coyote with a handgun. 5.7 is a fantastic choice. You want to hunt rattlesnake with a handgun. You want to hunt a myriad of other things. You like coon hunting with dogs, and make sure all this is legal wherever you are. I love coon hunting with dogs. I love running around at night with a light, a headlamp, an old school lantern, in the woods, whatever the case may be. Chasing after dogs that are treeing an animal, hounds, is a magnificent thing. And if you said, I want to do that with a handgun, I'd say 5.7, fantastic, practical choice. It's good for that. It's a great round for that size of animal. Even with the cheaper ammo, like whatever the Hornady red tip ammo is, it would do fine on that size game, I think. For, your coons, your possums, your fox, if that would be a challenging hunt, I think, hunting fox with a handgun. So that's a real world practical application. You just want the challenge of handgun hunting, and I love handgun hunting. I like it for the challenge. And you want to hunt something other than deer. I think if you're going to hunt deer, go 357, 44 mag, or another larger centerfire caliber. But if you want to hunt other things with a handgun, the 5.7, that's a real practical application for that. Now, let's talk CCW. I would not argue with somebody that shot and trained with their carry gun if they decided they wanted to carry a 5.7. I think it's totally legit. I won't argue with somebody if they have well thought out and reasoned arguments why they carry a 22 Magnum or 22 long rifle. I am not going to tell you that 22 long rifle is the best defensive caliber, nor 22 Magnum, nor 5.7. I don't think any of those are better than 9mm or 45 or 357 Magnum. But I think for the person that is going to shoot and train with that gun and use it, it's much better than not having a gun. And for somebody, I think there's two people that would really ring out a vast benefit, because you talk about recoil. For a beginning shooter where recoil is really an issue, and there's more to recoil than just felt recoil. The acoustics FN 5.7 can be quite a bombastic round. Bombastic is probably a good word to describe that. It can be very boisterous. It can be a loud, obnoxious round. For somebody that noise bothers them, this would not be a good choice. But for somebody where the actual physical felt recoil is an issue, that's the most that they're going to be comfortable with, then that's way better than them not carrying a gun, right? So if they're comfortable shooting that and they can shoot it without having to adjust their grip, and they're fine with that amount of recoil, the noise doesn't bother them, and the recoil is gentle enough that they find it advantageous, by all means, carry a 5.7. Don't let anybody tell you you're undergunned, because it's a lot better than having no gun. I applaud you for being a well-armed, responsible American. Almost on the other end of that spectrum, the guy that's really good, that can shoot really fast. I love competition shooting. One of my favorite competitions is Steel Challenge. I love Steel Challenge, or all steel matches, man-on-man steel matches. If you want to see drag racing with a handgun, go look up a Steel Challenge if you've never shot one, aren't familiar with it, and go look at the speed at which competitors run a Steel Challenge match. You go from 0 to hero real quick. You go from, slapping leather. Most times nowadays it's Kydex, but you get the expression. You go from slapping leather to putting 5 rounds on separate targets real fast. You're moving crazy fast, lightning fast. And for the guy that does that regularly with a big, full-size, long slide competition gun and can shoot really fast, but that's probably a gun bigger than he's likely to carry on a given day. If he can step down to a carryable gun, and I carry a full-size handgun, but it doesn't weigh nearly as much, and the 5.7, as we aforementioned, is light. It might be a large gun, but it's not a heavy gun. It wouldn't be a bad carry gun. This class of person that can shoot really fast and accurate, they could wring out a lot of advantage in a 5.7 because they can shoot crazy fast. They can have those really quick recovery and split times. They can get multiple hits on one target, or they can get multiple hits on multiple targets crazy fast. And they could step down to a lighter platform gun and still be able to do that. And I think that is a real advantage to the 5.7. Somebody that shoots Steel Challenge, shoots USPSA, but they're not going to be carrying their Glock 34 as a carry gun, for example, but they might carry the 5.7. They just like to go fast, and they can shoot fast and accurate, and they want a carryable, manageable weight of gun. I'd say that's a fantastic choice. There's a lot of merit there for somebody like that choosing a 5.7. And another practical use that I philosophized, on this trip, somebody that does road trips for their job quite frequently, and it's not feasible for them to carry a long gun. Maybe it's not their vehicle. Maybe they're going in a non-permissive environment. Maybe they are going with a group of people and all they can have is a small bag, but they still want to be armed, well armed. Again, you could fit a 5.7 handgun and quite a bit of ammunition, and it doesn't look like you're trying to smuggle bowling balls, right? It doesn't weigh a ton. If you had to do a long, let's say, several state trip, and for whatever reason you thought something might happen while you were on that trip and you needed firepower, you wanted a respectable round count without taking a big, bulky amount of space or weight. You're a courier, you're whatever you are, you're taking multi-state trips, couple of days, but you just can't, it's not feasible for you to have a long gun. Maybe consider the takedown gun episode, did a whole thing on takedown guns, but also a legit option would be a 5.7 handgun and a couple of hundred rounds. Again, a couple of hundred rounds of 5.7 is not like a couple of hundred rounds of 223 or a couple of hundred rounds of even 9mm. It is lightweight and compact. You might argue that it's better to have 150 rounds of 5.7 than it is to have 50 rounds of 9mm. And I wouldn't fault you for that. You look at the amount of space that 150 rounds of 5.7 takes up, it's probably comparable to that of 50 rounds of 9mm. And if that's all you're going to end up with, and you're states away from any of your other possessions really, except for what's in your suitcase, your luggage, your one backpack, I think you could do a lot worse than a 5.7, and let's just go with that number, 150 rounds. I think it's a good, solid, practical application for the FN 5.7. Anyway, those are some thoughts on the FN 5.7, some philosophy of what this cartridge is, why it's around, why it might be useful to you, why, even if you don't want to carry one, why some people may carry or may choose the 5.7. Tactical tip of the day. It's not going to be about the 5.7. It's going to be on a round we touched on. 22 long rifle. 22 long rifle makes a great training platform. Let's say you run a 9mm Smith & Wesson M&P, fantastic gun. You can get a Smith & Wesson M&P 22 and do a bunch of training with the 22. on range days where you're doing super high round count, those guns can get dirty real quick. One thing you can do, take your magazine and the brass that's in the magazine. Most 22 handgun magazines that I'm aware of have like a cutout in the middle. You can just take a small application you probably have in your range bag, some gun oil, just a drop or two intermittently throughout those magazines, especially when you're getting up in hundreds of rounds in a range day of 22. It just helps that cycle and keep that chamber lubricated, and it might keep that gun running quite a bit longer. If you want to take the time and take it apart and clean it, that's fine too, but just if you get into that point where rounds are starting to stick in that chamber, just a couple of drops of CLP or something like it, not on the bullets, but on the brass, especially the back of the brass. That tends to be, I think, a lot of times where it gets hung up. A lot of 22 long rifle is coated in wax, and a lot of times that can build up over time or get kind of gummed up in that chamber, and some of that CLP or something like it can really aid in that. I've seen that, there's nothing wrong with having malfunctions in training, but if you're having a malfunction every 2 or 3 rounds, that can get old real quick. So you put a couple of drops of this on the ammo in the magazine on the brass, and it can greatly, reduce the amount of malfunctions. If there's something else going on with your gun, it may not help, but if it's just dirty, you may think about doing that if you're on a range session with your 22 handgun. And for the tactical verse of the day, Psalm 18. It is God who arms me with strength and makes my way perfect. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer and sets me on high places. He teaches my hands to make war so that my arms can bend a bow of bronze. Thanks for listening, and have a blessed day.